Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. We're going to do something fun today. I'm going to talk about my favorite Sega Genesis games of all time. Now, growing up, the NES was my first home console, but when it came to the 16-bit era, we went with the Sega Genesis because it was a little bit cheaper than the Super Nintendo back in the day, and so I was a Genesis kid. I had this, the Sega CD, and the 32X. In this video, we're just going to talk about the Sega Genesis games in particular, and those that were the most important for me growing up, or some that I found later on in life that I really enjoy as well. And as with any of these lists, it'll be a little bit subjective, but these are my own personal favorites, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, before we start talking about the games, let's talk about some of the ways that I enjoy playing them. And by far, my favorite way to play Sega Genesis games is on this handheld. It is called the Anbernic RG-ARC. There are two variants of this device. There's one that boots into Android, like this one here, called the ARC-D, and a cheaper version that just boots into Linux called the ARC-S. I would recommend the ARC-S because it's cheaper. It usually can be found for around $60, and you don't really need Android at all on this device to enjoy Sega Genesis. The operating system that I use on this is called Rocknix, which is a Linux-based OS that just runs from the microSD card, and I keep this thing especially trim. I basically just have Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and Sega 32X games on it, and that is it. The obvious reasons why I love this handheld have to do with the 6-button layout, which is just a nice natural fit with the Sega Genesis titles that we'll be playing here today, and then it also has a shield-style D-pad. It's not exactly the same as it was on the original console, but it's good enough for me. This handheld is also excellent when it comes to 6-button fighting games, so you can play all your arcade games on here as well, but personally I just use it as a Sega Genesis machine. It's got a 4-inch 480p resolution screen, which works out pretty well for these types of games. It's not a perfect integer scale, but it's close enough for me, and so yeah, in general, this is how I play these games. It's worth noting that even though this device would be an excellent fit for Sega Saturn games, the processor inside of it doesn't really have the juice for it, and so I personally don't even bother. I just stick with the 16-bit alternatives. Another handheld you might want to consider if you want something vertical would be the Retroid Pocket Classic. This one has that same 6-button layout, which is very rare on a handheld like this, and it obviously will allow you to play all these games too. Some other nice factors about this one: it's got an OLED panel, which makes these games really pop, but then also it's got enough power to be able to play Sega Saturn as well, so if you are looking to play this particular system, then this one has the processing power for it. So let's just jump into the games and talk about my favorites. It's worth noting here that I'm not going to be ranking these in any way, so it's not like number 20 through number 1. I'm not even sure how many games I'm going to talk about. I just want to highlight some of my favorites and the stories that I have around them. It's also worth noting that I'm not really going to try to do any sort of stump the chump thing or try to show off any hidden gems. Like, these literally were just the games that I played growing up, and sometimes I played a popular game, sometimes I found just a weird, obscure one, but in general, these are the ones I enjoyed the most. Let's start at the very beginning of my experience of playing Sega Genesis games and what I considered the console to be when it first came out, and that was an excellent way to play some of my favorite arcade games. I think in the days before Sonic came out, this was the big selling point of the Sega Genesis, and so games like Altered Beast and Golden Axe and Strider, these all had arcade ports that you could play on a home console, and this was very exciting for me as a young child. I don't know what it was about the late 80s and early 90s, but for some reason it was easier to convince my parents to rent a video game than it was to actually have them give me physical money like quarters to play at an arcade. And so this was a dream come true for me. I could ask my parents, hey, can we rent Altered Beast or Golden Axe for the weekend? And I would be able to play through the entire game without having to dump a bunch of quarters into it. And in my young mind, these games looked just as good as they did in the arcade. I could not tell the difference between the two, and so the idea of playing these games at home was very attractive. I think among them, Strider was the one that looked the best. Back in the day, a lot of us judged how good a game was by how big the sprite was, and the Strider sprite was quite big. The problem with this one is that it was really difficult, and so I never got very far in Strider, but it was still very cool to be able to play it at home. But I think among them, my favorite arcade port was actually not really that much of a port at all. It was Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. The original arcade port had an isometric look to it and had a lot of funkiness to it, like the ability to make the enemies dance or to turn into a robot on the fly. Like there were some just very strange elements to the original arcade game, and the home console version was quite a bit different from that. Yes, you played as Michael Jackson, and yes, you rescued children from these bad guys, which is kind of problematic when you look at it in hindsight, but still very cool back in the day. It also had official Michael Jackson songs in the soundtrack, which was very cool at the time, and it also tied into the Moonwalker movie itself, which I also enjoyed back when it first released. And so I think what I liked about the Michael Jackson Moonwalker Genesis version was that it was different than the arcade port. It was still very cool to play these arcade games, but also kind of cool that I had my own version that I could play at home. Okay, next I want to talk about some of my favorite Disney-related games, because these were also really important to me as a kid. Now, we'll start with Castle of Illusion. This one came out in 1990, so I was 10 years old at the time, and this is a game that I never really got to play back in the day, but it was something that I saw in a lot of game catalogs, like the old Sears catalog. I remember seeing the graphics for this game and just being amazed. It looked like you could play an animated movie, which was just a really big deal back in the day. I just loved looking at pictures of this game and thinking, man, this must be awesome to play. Now, I didn't actually get to play it until later on through emulation, but one game I did get to play that came out a year after that was Quackshot, starring Donald Duck. And honestly, this is still one of my favorite action platformers available on the Sega Genesis writ large. It just feels very good. It's a very simple game. You just jump and then you can shoot your plunger gun. You can get other weapons later on in the game, but it's a very simple mechanic. What really sets this one apart, though, is that it does have a surprising amount of depth to it. There is a map and you can travel across the map, which is not something that you often would do in games that came out at this time. And your gun also would upgrade over time, and so it became more useful the later you get into the game. And so that was also another really cool aspect of it. And it was also very cool to be able to play with known Disney IP. As a kid, I was always confused as to why it didn't tie into the DuckTales universe, which was around that same time, but all the same, yes, this is an excellent platformer game if you're looking for something that's a little bit more lighthearted and fun. But I think overall, my favorite Disney-related game is Aladdin. And this is kind of funny because it's one of my least favorite movies from around this era, but man, this thing looks so beautiful. The animation on this is very smooth and fun looking, and I believe that some of the animators who worked on the movie also worked on this game, and you can definitely tell it feels like a tier above. I know there are people who prefer the Super Nintendo version of this game over the Genesis one, and I just cannot understand that. I think it mostly has to do with nostalgia and which one you played as a kid, but I think objectively, the Genesis version is definitely the better looking of the two. And this was a big win for us back during the console wars of the 16-bit era, because it was very rare where a Sega Genesis version of a game looked and played better than the Super Nintendo version, so this was a big deal. The game itself is challenging, it's punishing, and the hitbox is just a little bit too big, so it feels cheap when the enemy hits you, but overall still something that I can recommend today. Next, I want to talk about my favorite weird game, which was Earthworm Jim. Now, I know a lot of people prefer a different game that's a little bit weird called Toe Jam and Earl. It's a totally different game, all things considered, but they do kind of get lumped together. And for me personally, I preferred Earthworm Jim. This game is also an action platformer. It's pretty simple as well. You can jump, you have a gun which has limited ammo, and then also you can use your whole body as a whip. After all, you were just a worm in a suit. The animation for this one also is very cool, and it's got some quirky humor to it, and so yeah, in general, I do definitely enjoy this game. It's also very tough, and I do find it to be a little bit floaty and unforgiving with its platforming elements, but in general, I think it's still a pretty fun game, and definitely a milestone when it came to action platformers that were not your typical Mario or Sonic games. Now, later in the Genesis life cycle, there were a lot of different platformers, and some of them took off and some of them did not. It felt like Sega was trying out a bunch of them to come up with a new mascot. A prime example of that was Ristar, sometimes called Ristar. This is a game that is an action platformer, but you actually have hands and you can grab your enemies, which was a unique mechanic at the time. I never really played this one that much because it came out so late in the life cycle of this console, and so I think I maybe rented it one time, but it never really stuck with me. Another example is Rocket Knight Adventure. I used to hear about this one all the time, but I never actually got to play it until later on in life, and I can definitely recognize why this one is so cool. You got a weapon, you can actually hit your enemies, which is not something that you could typically do in a lot of these older games. I will say that the one platformer that did stand out for me that I did play pretty often was Vector Man, and I think this one is definitely worth your attention as well. This one's unique in several different ways. Number one, I love the graphics for it. It just feels very advanced for the Sega Genesis console. It kind of feels to me like Donkey Kong Country did on the Super Nintendo, where it just brought it all to a new elevated level. So visually, I always loved this game, but I also loved the shooting mechanic as well. It reminded me a lot of Mega Man. Now, there was a port of a Mega Man game on Sega Genesis, but I never really played it. I always associated Mega Man with Nintendo and Super Nintendo, and so this one kind of felt like the Genesis alternative to those older games. The game itself is quite chaotic and challenging, and so it does require you to memorize the levels so that you can get through them. It's not something that you can just react to in real time, and so if you're looking for a challenging shooter style game, then Vector Man is a lot of fun. Another side-scrolling franchise that I really enjoyed were the Shinobi games. A lot of people are familiar with Revenge of Shinobi, which is Shinobi 2. It came out on the Sega Genesis in the late 80s, so it was an early launch game for this console, but it was Shinobi 3, which is the game we're looking at right here, which is the one that I prefer. This one came out a few years later and definitely took advantage of all the development work that had happened on the Sega Genesis. So the graphics on this one are so much better, the audio as well, and the gameplay is a little bit more rich. In the end, it is a typical Shinobi game, so you're just going to go from left to right, you're going to shoot your enemies, and you can either duck below the bullets as they come towards you, or you can use other methods to attack them. And so yes, this is a really cool game, and visually just one of the more stunning games on the Sega Genesis. One of the reasons why I like this game so much is because it's a little bit easier than Revenge of Shinobi, but the difficulty ramps up a bunch near the end of the game, so it's a game that's hard to beat but very easy to play through for the most part. Now, before we talk about our next game, I want to preface it by talking about a different one. And we're going to start by talking about X-Men for the Sega Genesis. And this is actually one of my least favorite games for this console. In fact, I consider it to be the most disappointing game that I ever played on the Sega Genesis. It all really comes down to the original arcade game, which is something that I played before the Genesis game came out, and I loved this game. This thing was just an awesome side-scrolling beat-em-up, and one of those games that I just truly treasured back when I was a kid. This was at the height of X-Men mania, when the show had first come out and that first issue from Jim Lee had come out on comics, and so I was just huge into X-Men, especially Wolverine, and I was hoping that by getting the Sega Genesis version that I would get a port from the arcade version, much like I'd seen with other games that had been on the platform. I remember saving up a bunch of money before the game came out, mowing lawns and doing all sorts of other odd jobs, and then buying the X-Men Genesis game the day it came out, sight unseen. I didn't know anything about it. I had never seen a picture of it before. And I remember that drive home, just holding the box and reading through the manual and getting so excited. It definitely didn't look like the arcade game, but it still looked pretty cool. But of course, once I started playing the game, I was really disappointed. A lot of it had to do with just how the game felt. It was a bit laggy as you were playing it. Even though visually it looked pretty cool, it wasn't that fun to actually play. I also felt like the mutant powers were kind of crappy in this game. For example, with Wolverine, if you turned on your mutant powers, it just meant that you could extract your claws and then use them. So it gave you a little bit more range, but that was about it. On top of that, it was just insanely difficult, to the point where I rarely got past level 1, which was just super frustrating for me to save up my 50 hard-earned dollars and then just lose them all on one single level. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because one of the developers of X-Men is also the main developer of Ecco the Dolphin, one of my favorite games on the Sega Genesis. This game was so unlike all the others at the time. It had a beautiful visual quality to it, and the overall HUD and the game screen itself was very simple. It just had a life bar and then an oxygen bar, and that was it. As a dolphin, your moves are overall fairly simple. You can press the C button to speed up, the B button is your dash button, which also is your attack, and then you have your A button, which will enable your sonar so that you can interact with others, and that was really about it. The cool thing was that you can jump out of the water and do special tricks, and that was always really fun and very beautiful and smooth looking in terms of animation. The gameplay experience is not quite as good as the game itself looks. For example, you are often going to be hit by enemies in a way that feels a little bit cheap, and the sound of Ecco getting damage is also something that just grates on me. Like, the overall sound in general is super annoying. On top of that, I found this to be a very stressful game back in the day because I was always hunting for oxygen, because the moment that starts to run out, your life bar does as well. And so it was a pretty challenging game, but one that we actually owned, and so I played this one a lot. Even though I kind of suck at the game now, I was very good back in the day where I could actually beat it in one sitting, which was something that was very unique to me. It also had a password system, so as soon as you beat a level, it would give you the password to be able to go back to that level if you wanted to, and so that made everything a little bit easier to swallow as well. I wouldn't say this game has aged very well over time. There are probably more exciting games that you could play on the Genesis, but this one definitely has a special place in my heart. Okay, next let's talk about driving games. I didn't play a ton of these back in the day. There were a bunch that were motorcycle related, like Road Rash and Super Hang-On. I didn't play those very often. Instead, I mostly stuck to a couple classics. Number one was Outrun. I really enjoyed this game. This one was also an arcade port, not quite as good as the original arcade one, especially because I didn't have a driving wheel or anything like that. So this was one I played every once in a while, but I did find it to be pretty hard. There were also other driving games like Grand Prix and F1 games, and I played those every once in a while, but my absolute favorite was Road Blasters. This one was actually developed by Atari Games, years before the Sega Genesis was available in the United States, but I used to see it everywhere on arcade. They had an NES port, but it was the Genesis one that I liked the most, just because it looked so good. In the most simple sense, it's just a pretty basic arcade racing game, but you also have a gun and you can shoot the other cars, and that was always very cool back in the day, especially as a guy who grew up playing games like Rad Racer on the NES. This just felt like a whole nother level of gameplay. They also had additional pickups like these green or red pills that would give you additional fuel, and this was also very cool for me. So instead of just racing against the clock, you could also just manipulate that yourself and play a little bit longer by picking up those pickups. In hindsight, it's not the best driving game available on the Genesis, but it was my favorite. It felt like a mix of Outrun and then something like Spy Hunter, and so I love that additional gameplay mechanic. Another genre I didn't play a lot of back in the day on the Genesis was role-playing games. There weren't that many available, and I often just overlooked them because I wasn't really sure which ones to pick up. There were a lot of sequels. I remember seeing like Shining Force 2 or Phantasy Star 3, and I wasn't really sure if I was able to play them or if I had to play the first ones before it. So as a young kid, I was kind of confused about which games I should actually play, and even then, most of the RPGs were available on the Super Nintendo, and so I would play those over at friends' houses instead. One RPG that I did play quite a bit of was Beyond Oasis. This one was a later game on the Sega Genesis console, but it had excellent graphics and a more action RPG element. A lot of people compare this one to Zelda games, and I think that's about right, because it is more action oriented and you can consult a map and then go and traverse it. It all feels very much so like just a single player on a larger map, and so that is very similar to the Zelda game, so that makes sense to me too. It's got some pretty light RPG elements to it compared to like a turn-based game, and so in that sense it does feel a bit more like an action game, but you do level up your character in certain ways by getting better weapons or other companions. And the gameplay itself still holds up today. It's a pretty fun action game, so if you're looking for something with a little bit more depth to it than your typical arcade-style game, this is definitely it. I will note that in prepping for this video and recording a bunch of footage, I did try out some of those other old school RPGs that I had never really played back in the day, and I was personally blown away by Phantasy Star 4. I don't know what it was about this game that kind of kept me away from it back in the day, but I kind of feel bad that I did not play it back then, because this is such an excellent game. The dialogue itself just looks a lot more interactive than your typical Final Fantasy game, because you have these little animation panels, which I think are really cool and immersive. On top of that, the battle system is actually pretty neat as well. You can have a party of up to, I think, 4 people altogether. At least that's how many I found in the first couple hours that I've played this game so far. And you can upgrade your weapons and your armor. And it kind of has a first-person perspective to it, much like the Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior games. And so I really like that overall element to it. So as much as I think that Beyond Oasis is probably my favorite RPG just by default, Phantasy Star 4 is pretty awesome. I actually loaded this up recently on all my other handhelds so that I can play this a little bit more. Now, in terms of puzzle games, there were not a lot of choices on Genesis. I know there were like the Puyo Puyo games, but I never really played those back in the day. The only puzzle game that I really played during the console's heyday was Columns, and I did really enjoy this game. This one came out a little bit after Tetris, and so it didn't have that same zeitgeist and amount of enthusiasm behind it, but I still think it's a pretty solid puzzle game. Looking at it today, it kind of feels like a match 3 game, you know, those like Bejeweled, that's also mixed with that falling block style of Tetris. There's not a lot you can do in this game. You essentially just shuffle the order of the jewels as they're falling down, and you try to match them for at least 3 in a row or more. What I really love about this game is that once you have it all built up and you start just adding your jewels and then they start matching, they can start to collapse on one another and you can create these combos. And that felt very unique compared to something like Tetris, which felt more deliberate. Once you get the hang of using the diagonal matches as well, it can feel really cool. So yes, I think this is still a game that holds up. Now, the Sega Genesis came at a time where national sports felt like a really big deal, thanks to superstars like Joe Montana in football, and then, you know, obviously Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson in basketball. And I personally loved playing basketball games on the Sega Genesis, and I started all the way back in the beginning with some of the early sports titles like Jordan vs. Bird. At the time, this felt like it was the coolest game ever, that you could play one-on-one with an opponent, and then also you could play as either Jordan or Bird. It even had a slam dunk contest inside of this game, which was awful. It was so hard to actually do any of these slam dunks, but man, it was super cool that it existed in the first place. In the following years, EA really got into their stride when it came to basketball games. It first started with the Bulls vs. Blazers and Bulls vs. Lakers games that came out in the early 90s. These were cool for a couple reasons. Number one, you could play as the actual sports teams of that year or the year previous, and so that was also very cool, especially when we had so many superstars in the NBA at the time. A lot of these players had their own signature moves as well, so like Jordan had his own dunks, Sean Kemp had his own dunk. Those things were very cool. You could also participate in the actual playoff games of that year. So you would have the same brackets and same teams and same players. And so that was also a very cool element back in the day. The gameplay itself was quite slow and plodding, but at the time we thought it was very realistic. Now things jumped up another level once we got into the NBA Live games, which I think started in NBA Live 95. At least this was the first one that I personally played. The perspective of these games changed to an isometric layout, which I thought felt a lot more immersive. On top of that, the crowd sounds on this game were excellent. It just felt like you were really there. The gameplay itself was also faster and looser, and so everything just felt a little bit more realistic. And so this was probably one of my favorite team-based NBA games at the time. The only bummer about these games is that you couldn't play as Michael Jordan, but in NBA Live 96, if you made a character named Michael Jordan, it would actually have the exact same stats and look as Michael Jordan himself. So that was a quick workaround. The only other basketball game that I want to bring up is NBA Jam Tournament Edition. This is more of an arcade style basketball game, but also a lot of fun, and you could play as most of the main superstars. This was a 2-on-2 game that originally came out on arcade, but then was ported over to the home consoles, and this thing was a lot of fun as well. If you haven't ever played an NBA Jam game, these are awesome, and they also inspired later games for EA, including the NBA Street games. In the end, I still do prefer the NBA Live games as my favorite basketball games on the Sega Genesis, but NBA Jam probably holds up a little bit better nowadays. For most of the other sports games, I didn't really play them that much. There were some boxing games that I played every once in a while, but I didn't really enjoy them too much. And then when it came to football, I didn't really like Madden, and I also didn't like the Joe Montana Sports Talk games. They were just a little bit too difficult. And so what became my favorite football game for the Genesis was Mutant League Football, just because it was so different. This one used the Madden engine, so the gameplay itself was pretty similar to that, but they had just some really wacky and fun things. You know, each of the levels were a little bit different, like the fields would sometimes like grab you or you would fall in a pit. But you could also do some other crazy things like kill the ref if you wanted to. If you didn't like the calls that he was playing, you would get a penalty for it, but it was still totally worth it. On top of that, you could change the amount of violence that would happen in the game, so you could just flat out kill people if you tackled them hard enough. That would take them out of the game, and often you would recover the football at the same time. When it came down to it, I just preferred to play Tecmo Super Bowl on the NES compared to any of these other more modern football games, but my favorite among them was Mutant League Football. I don't think I could actually get through this video without also talking about NHL 94, which is regarded as one of the best hockey games of all time. I didn't play a lot of hockey games back in the day, but I did definitely enjoy this one, especially the multiplayer aspect of it. This one would settle arguments pretty fast or else create their own problems depending on the situation. There was also a Mutant League hockey version that looked very similar to this and had all of the same wackiness of the football game, but I preferred the straight NHL 94. Now, around the same time that the Sega Genesis was out was also the time of Turtle Mania, so there were a lot of Ninja Turtle things going on in the world at the time. The original arcade game came out before the Sega Genesis, but we got a port of that for the NES, but on the Genesis we only had one specific game, and it was this one, Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist. Now admittedly, among all of the Ninja Turtle games, this one doesn't quite hold a candle to Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, which was on the Super Nintendo, but it's still a very fun game. It is just your typical beat-em-up game with the Ninja Turtles characters, so nothing super special about it, but it was unique in that it only came out on the Sega Genesis, so that was one really cool thing about having the console at the time. But all the same, my favorite beat-em-up game on the Sega Genesis was and remains Streets of Rage 2. Now, I played Streets of Rage 1 back in the day, I really liked that one too, but Streets of Rage 2 was a lot better. The sprites were bigger, the graphics were a lot smoother, the gameplay felt a lot better too. The soundtrack of this game is iconic. In fact, I often will use it in my audio tests when testing out different hardware, and that's because I just often enjoy listening to these songs. Now, in full disclosure, I did prefer Final Fight over Streets of Rage back in the day. Mostly it had to do with the size of the sprites, which were a lot bigger on the arcade and Super Nintendo versions of Final Fight compared to Streets of Rage 2. However, looking at these games through a modern lens, I do think that Streets of Rage 2 has held up very well. It's a little bit faster and a bit more forgiving than the Final Fight games, and so in that sense, I think between the two right now, I would rather play Streets of Rage 2. This one held up a little bit better. Okay, next up we're going to talk about Gunstar Heroes. This is a game that I absolutely did not have access to when I was a kid. It was something that I heard about later on in life and only played through emulation. But man, this is a really good side-scrolling shoot-'em-up. This game was made by Treasure, one of the most regarded shoot-'em-up developers, and so it's really cool that we had a game like this on the Sega Genesis. It kind of plays a little bit like Metal Slug, but is just a lot more explosive and faster, and so I can definitely see why people love this game. It's still one of my favorite games to play on Genesis via emulation, but unfortunately just wasn't one that I was able to play back in the day. This game is often at the top of many people's lists when they talk about the best game on the Sega Genesis, and I completely understand why. It's just fast and fun, and it really does hold up today. So if you're trying to just have a more action-oriented experience on the Sega Genesis, this is definitely an easy pick. One other lesser-known game made by Treasure for the Sega Genesis was Alien Soldier. This one is equally fast, but then also very cool visually too. Like with Gunstar Heroes, I did not hear about this game back in the day. I only started playing it later via emulation, but if you're looking for something along those same lines, but with a little bit more complexity in terms of the weapon options, then I think that Alien Soldier is definitely worth checking out. They also classified this one as being a boss rush game because there are so many different bosses that you have to attack, and so that may be something that would appeal to you as well. Now, speaking of games that came out later in the life cycle, let's talk about some aftermarket games, those that were made for the Sega Genesis well after the life cycle of the machine. One of my favorite studios that has made games for this console is called Neofid. They are based out of Europe, and they've made a couple different games, Demons of Asterborg as well as Astabros, and these are really complex and fun platformer games, and it's kind of amazing the depth of gameplay that they were able to sandwich into the Sega Genesis hardware. Between the two, my favorite is Astabros. This one is a roguelite that also has procedurally generated dungeons. Again, just kind of amazing that this is available on the Genesis in the first place. These games were also released on Steam, so you could just play them on PC, but the PC game files include the Genesis ROM, so you can play them in multiple ways. My favorite aftermarket game is Xenocrisis. This one came out in 2019, and it's a multi-directional shooter, kind of like Smash TV from back in the day, but with more updated graphics and a lot of gore. To be fair, this game is tough as nails, so be prepared to have a challenge when playing this one. They've got two difficulties, there's easy and hard, and honestly, both of them are hard. This one is also multi-platform. You can get it on basically everything, PC and Mac and Switch and Xbox and PS4. Okay, next up, I only really have two other games I want to talk about, but I'm also going to talk about the context of each of them because there are many games that surround them that are worth mentioning as well. Let's start with Sonic the Hedgehog. So the very first Sonic game on the Sega Genesis, one of the very first games I ever owned on this console, and honestly, one of the main reasons why I wanted a Genesis in the first place. Back in the day, in the 16-bit era, most of us had the choice between a Super Nintendo and a Sega Genesis, and it really came down to Super Mario World versus Sonic the Hedgehog. There were some other factors involved, like the price of the console. The Genesis was a little bit cheaper, and so that's honestly why we went with that one instead. But one of the cool things about this was that they felt very different from one another in terms of these main platforming games. Super Mario World is obviously awesome in its own right. It's still one of my favorite games of all time. But at the time, back when I was, 10 or 11 years old when this first came out, I was more diehard Sonic the Hedgehog. And the reason why I preferred Sonic is very simple. Number one, it's a very fast game, and so it just feels like it's very cutting edge as you're playing it. And then number two, I loved the whole ring system. The idea behind this game is that you could collect rings, and then if you got to 100, you would get an extra life. And then if you got to 50 by the end of the level, you could also get into the special level as well. But for me as a kid, the reason why I loved the rings at the time was because it felt like it made me immortal. Because as long as I was holding on to at least one ring, if I got hit by an enemy, I wouldn't die. I would just lose the ring and I could recover it right then and then keep playing the rest of the game. This gave me a huge advantage at some of the harder to play levels on Sonic the Hedgehog because I felt like I could keep going no matter what as long as I kept at least one ring going. Looking back, it's probably a little silly to prefer one game over the other because of that mechanic, but for somebody who, was a little bit challenged with video games back in the day, this made a big difference for me, and this was a game that I could beat, whereas Mario World was just too complex and hard. Now, objectively, I think that Sonic 2 was the superior of these two games. It had a split-screen multiplayer aspect to it, it also introduced Tails, it also had a spin dash mechanic, and then I think the secret levels were just better looking and more fun to play. We owned both of these, and I did find myself playing Sonic 2 more than Sonic 1 once I got my hands on it, especially some of those later levels which were very unique, but I still think that Sonic 1 is my favorite among the two just because of all the nostalgia that I have attached to it. This might be a hot take, but I was never a fan of Sonic 3. I found this one to be too complex and busy, and it also came out just too late in the life cycle of the machine where we didn't actually ever own it, and I never really enjoyed this one as much. I know a lot of people prefer this one over the two others, and that's totally cool, but for me personally, it's actually the first Sonic game that I prefer the most. Now for my last game, I've got a lot of build up to talk about it. We're going to talk about fighting games, which was probably the most important genre of games for me as a young child. I was obsessed with these games. If there was a 1v1 fighter that I could rent or buy, then I honestly would probably prioritize that one over any other game on the console. It all started with seeing some of those old school fighting games in the arcades back in the day, Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, but those were not ported to the Sega Genesis until a bit later. So in the lead up to that, my first fighting game was actually Fatal Fury, which is a port of the Neo Geo game. So this is the game that I actually cut my teeth on. The mechanics in this one are very similar to Street Fighter, so I learned how to do my Hadoukens and Shoryukens from playing this game in particular. I also played just about every single fighting game that came to the Sega Genesis. I played stuff like World Heroes, another Neo Geo port, Eternal Champions, which was one of the only Sega Genesis exclusive fighting games that we had at the time, Primal Rage, which was an arcade port, even stuff like Shaq Fu and that terrible Ninja Turtles fighting game and Time Killers. I played all these on the Genesis back in the day. Probably one of the most monumental moments for me in the fighting world on the Sega Genesis was when the first Mortal Kombat came out. This one was a multi-platform release. It came out on the Game Gear, Game Boy, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo all at the same time. If you were around back then, you probably remember how the entire United States went crazy about the violence of Mortal Kombat. They were having all sorts of hearings about it. I mean, it trickled down to me as a kid as well. The first Mortal Kombat game required you to actually put in a code in the very beginning. It was ABACABB, a code that I will never forget, and that would turn the screen a little bit red, and that would allow you to have blood in the game, including fatalities. Now, the Genesis port of the original Mortal Kombat was not great. It had super small sprites, and the gameplay itself was a little bit laggy, but honestly, I did not care. I thought it was so cool that I could play this game, and then I could use the blood code and actually do fatalities, like ripping off somebody's head with Sub-Zero, always one of my favorite things to do back then. The Super Nintendo one looked better, it had larger sprites, and it also did have a blood code, but it wasn't quite the same look and feel, and so I did prefer the Genesis version overall. However, this was not my favorite fighting game on the Sega Genesis. That was Mortal Kombat 2, which came out a little bit later. By this time, the world had calmed down about video game violence, and so there was no requirement for a blood code. You could just immediately get the blood and the fatalities and everything else. This game was also quite a bit more complicated. It had more characters to choose from, and it also had other types of fatalities like babalities and friendships, which were really kind of cool at the time. Among all of the different games on the Sega Genesis, this one is probably the one I put the most hours in. I had every single move and fatality and all the other stuff memorized for this particular game. Nowadays, I've forgotten all of it. In fact, I can't really do any of these moves. It's kind of crazy how much I have forgotten over the past 30 years. All the same, I always loved Mortal Kombat 2 and the amount of complexity to it and just the overall fun of playing this, either on my own or against my friends. I also did pick up Mortal Kombat 3 when it came out, and I played this one quite a bit too. This one was even more complex. This one had a combo system to it, and then all those additional fatalities and everything else too. So when it comes to bang for your buck in terms of characters and different moves and complexity, then Mortal Kombat 3 and then later Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 is probably going to be your best bang for your buck, but I personally preferred Mortal Kombat 2. Later on, we did eventually get Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition for the Sega Genesis, but this thing came out so late in the life cycle of the Genesis that I actually never owned it. And even to this day, I still consider the Sega Genesis to be a more Mortal Kombat friendly console compared to something like Street Fighter, just because I spent most of my time playing Mortal Kombat games on this particular device. So there we go, there's a list of all my favorite Genesis games. Now, I didn't touch on every single one. There are some others that I thought were pretty cool back in the day, but didn't quite rise to the point of making it to this list. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. There were over 800 games released for this console, and so I've only scratched the surface of all the other ones that you could play. So if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me your top 3 Sega Genesis games of all time. I'm really eager to learn about everything else that other people played. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.